Dictators spend decades creating one illusion that they are untouchable. They surround themselves with soldiers, ministers, propaganda, and portraits of their own faces. They rewrite constitutions, silence opponents, and force entire countries to pretend that their rule will never end. But here's the strange part. Most dictators do not lose power when the public stops believing the illusion. They lose power when the people closest to them stop pretending. One dictator entered a meeting expecting another ordinary day and left in an ambulance as a prisoner. Another flew abroad, only to discover that his entire empire had disappeared before he could return. One tried to resign from thousands of miles away, but his own parliament refused to let him choose how his presidency ended. Another climbed into a helicopter to escape a revolution, without realizing that the pilot had already turned against him. One dictator was defeated by just 15 minutes of television, a rainbow, and an unbearably cheerful pop song. And perhaps the strangest of all, one ruler was secretly removed from office, but the people around him continued bringing him fake newspapers, so he would believe he was still running the country. These are not simply stories about coups, elections, or revolutions. They are stories about the exact moment when fear stopped working, because a dictatorship can appear invincible from the outside. But behind closed doors, it often depends on something incredibly fragile. A group of ordinary people agreeing to keep the dictator's fantasy alive. Here are 10 infamous rulers, and the bizarre, humiliating, and often accidental ways they finally lost power. Benito Mussolini had spent more than 2 decades constructing a state built around his personality. But his first fall did not begin with Allied troops storming his office. It began during a meeting. On the night of July 24, 1943, Mussolini gathered the Grand Council of Fascism, the highest body within the movement he had created. He expected criticism. What he did not expect was betrayal. After hours of debate, the council voted on a motion that effectively removed his authority. 19 members voted against him. Only 8 remained loyal. Among the men who abandoned Mussolini was his own son-in-law, Galeazzo Ciano. The following day, Mussolini met King Victor Emmanuel III. He apparently expected a discussion about how the regime could survive Italy's military disasters. Instead, the king informed him that he had been replaced. When Mussolini left the meeting, police were waiting. He was taken away under arrest, reportedly inside an ambulance to avoid attracting attention. The man who had filled streets with marching crowds did not initially lose power in a great public battle. He lost it through a vote held by his own fascists and a quiet royal appointment that made him irrelevant overnight. Portugal's Antonio Salazar experienced an even stranger ending. In 1968, after suffering serious health problems, Salazar became incapable of governing effectively. Portugal's president replaced him with Marcelo Caetano, but Salazar's condition created an unusual problem. The people surrounding him were reportedly afraid that revealing the truth might worsen his health. So instead of simply telling him that his rule was over, they maintained the appearance that nothing had changed. Documents were brought to him. Political routines continued around him. According to later accounts, a special version of his daily newspaper was even prepared that removed references to the new government. Inside Salazar's private world, he was still the leader of Portugal. Outside that room, the country had already moved on without him. For nearly 2 years, the illusion reportedly continued. Salazar did not lose power through execution, invasion, or a dramatic public uprising. He was simply replaced and then protected from the knowledge that he was no longer important. The regime had become so independent of its creator that it could continue without him, while allowing him to believe he remained in control. Salazar may have died in 1970, still thinking that Portugal was waiting for his decisions. Jean Bedel Bokassa did not merely call himself president. In 1976, he transformed the Central African Republic into the Central African Empire and crowned himself emperor in an extraordinarily expensive ceremony. But 3 years later, Bokassa made a fatal mistake. He left the country. While Bokassa was visiting Libya in September 1909, France helped organize an operation to remove him. Former President David Dacko was brought back, and French forces entered the Bangui. Bokassa's defenders offered little meaningful resistance. By the time the emperor understood what was happening, the Central African Empire had already ceased to exist. Its name was changed back to the Central African Republic. Dako was restored as president, and Bokassa was stranded abroad. There was no final battle inside an imperial palace, no desperate speech to his subjects. The emperor had left for an international visit and returned to discover that he was no longer an emperor, and that the country he had renamed after himself had been renamed again. His empire disappeared while he was out of the office. In 2000, Peru's Alberto Fujimori was watching his government collapse around him. A secretly recorded video had shown his intelligence chief, Vladimir Montesinos, handing cash to an opposition politician. It became the first of numerous recordings exposing corruption at the heart of the regime. Fujimori left Peru for an international summit. Then he traveled to Japan and remained there. From a hotel in Tokyo, thousands of miles from Lima, Fujimori submitted his resignation. The image was extraordinary. A ruler who had dominated Peru for a decade, attempting to end his presidency remotely, with the resignation becoming permanently associated with a fax machine. But Peru's Congress refused to give him even that final piece of control. It rejected his resignation. Instead, legislators voted to remove him for what the Constitution described as permanent moral incapacity. That distinction mattered. Fujimori wanted history to record that he had voluntarily stepped aside. Congress wanted history to record that Peru had dismissed him. After years of deciding who could remain in office, Fujimori could not even decide how he himself would leave it. When revolution reached Bucharest in December 1989, Nicolae Ceaușescu attempted to escape by helicopter. For a brief moment, it appeared possible that he might reach loyal forces and organize resistance. But the man flying the helicopter, Colonel Vasily Malutsan, had apparently decided that the dictator's rule was finished. Malutsan later said he told Ceaușescu that the helicopter had been detected by radar and was in danger of being shot down. That warning pushed Ceaușescu toward a decision that destroyed his remaining chance of escape. He ordered the helicopter to land. Once on the ground, Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu were forced to continue their flight in vehicles, relying on increasingly uncertain help as the state around them disintegrated. They were eventually captured, subjected to a hurried military trial, and executed on Christmas Day. But the decisive moment may have occurred before their capture. Ceaușescu still believed that the aircraft, the pilot, and the system surrounding him were obeying his commands. In reality, the pilot was using Ceaușescu's own fear to bring him back to the ground. The dictator was not defeated by enemy radar. He was defeated by a sentence spoken inside his own helicopter. Not every dictator was removed by a coup. In 1988, Chile held a referendum that would determine whether Augusto Pinochet could remain president for another 8 years. The opposition faced an enormous disadvantage. Pinochet's government controlled much of the public narrative, and years of repression had taught many Chileans that resistance was dangerous. Each side was given only 15 minutes of television advertising each night during the official campaign. The obvious opposition strategy would have been to focus entirely on torture, disappearances, and death. But the No campaign made a surprising choice. It used a rainbow. Its advertisements showed music, smiling families, humor, and an optimistic slogan promising that joy was coming to Chile. This was not an attempt to deny the regime's crimes. It was an attempt to defeat the emotion keeping Pinochet in power: fear. The campaign presented democracy not as another terrifying conflict, but as a future ordinary people could actually want. The No side won. Pinochet remained commander-in-chief of the army for years and continued to possess influence. But he had lost the referendum designed to legitimize another presidential term. A military ruler who had survived armed opposition was politically defeated by limited television airtime, bright colors, and the promise that life could feel normal again. The popular version of Manuel Noriega's fall sounds almost too perfect. After the United States invaded Panama in 1989, Noriega took refuge inside the Vatican's diplomatic mission. American forces surrounded the building and blasted loud music toward it. The playlist reportedly included songs whose titles seemed chosen to mock him. The story became irresistible. a dictator driven out by relentless rock music. But the lesser-known reality is more complicated. The music annoyed senior American officials as well as the Vatican. President George H.W. Bush reportedly described the tactic as irritating and petty. General Colin Powell ordered it stopped. Noriega was even said to have slept through much of the noise. And crucially, the music ended before he surrendered. The spectacle became far more famous than its actual effectiveness. Noriega finally left the building after pressure and negotiations involving the papal representative, not because one particular rock song broke his will. The soundtrack survived because it made a better story than the truth. Noriega lost power through invasion, isolation, and the collapse of his military position. The music was mostly background noise. Francisco Macias Nguema ruled Equatorial Guinea through extreme violence and fear. But in 1979, the danger began to reach members of his own family and inner circle. His nephew, Teodoro Obiang, helped lead the coup that removed him. Macias fled from the new government, reportedly destroying part of the treasury before attempting to escape toward the border. He was captured and placed before a special military tribunal in Malibu. His trial was remarkable because it was open to an international legal observer, an unusual event in a country where the judicial system had largely collapsed under his rule. Macias and several co-defendants were condemned to death. There was no lengthy appeals process. According to the International Commission of Jurists, those sentenced to death were executed within hours, leaving no meaningful opportunity for appeals for clemency. Macias had spent years making legal procedure irrelevant whenever it stood between him and his enemies. When he finally became the accused, the institutions required to protect him barely existed, and the nephew who removed him did not establish a lasting democracy. He became the country's next ruler. Muammar Gaddafi's final attempt to escape Sirte in October 2011 involved a convoy of armed vehicles. NATO aircraft attacked the convoy, scattering it and contributing to the chain of events that led to Gaddafi's capture. It sounds like the final stage of a carefully planned operation to eliminate him. But NATO later stated that it did not know Gaddafi was traveling in the convoy when the strike was launched. According to the alliance, the vehicles were targeted because they carried weapons and appeared to pose a threat to civilians. Not because intelligence had identified Gaddafi among them. NATO said it learned only later that he had been present. That means one of the most consequential attacks of the Libyan conflict may not have been a direct hunt for Gaddafi at all. The strike disrupted his escape. Fighters on the ground discovered him afterward, and he died following his capture, in circumstances that remained disputed. A ruler who had survived multiple assassination attempts was finally exposed by an attack whose pilots supposedly did not even know they had found him. By May 1998, Indonesia was trapped in economic crisis, demonstrations, and deadly unrest. After 32 years in power, Suharto attempted to regain control by promising political reform. He proposed a reform committee and planned to reshuffle his cabinet. It was a familiar authoritarian strategy: change the people surrounding the ruler while leaving the ruler in place. But this time, the insiders refused to cooperate. 14 cabinet members reportedly rejected participation in the proposed new government. Their decision was devastating. These were not street protesters whom Suharto could dismiss as enemies. They were members of the system, people whose participation was necessary to make his promised reform look credible. Without them, a new cabinet would expose rather than conceal his weakness. Facing pressure from protesters, political leaders, and members of his own government, Suharto resigned on May 21, 1998. After 3 decades of centralized power, his rule ended when the people needed to stage one final performance, refused to walk onto the stage. These dictators lost power in completely different ways. One was betrayed during a meeting, one was removed without being told. One lost an empire while traveling abroad, one could not even get his resignation accepted. One was grounded by his own pilot. One lost a referendum to 15 minutes of optimism. Another became the subject of a myth in which rock music received more credit than the soldiers, diplomats, and negotiations surrounding him. But underneath, every ending was the same weakness. No dictator rules alone. Power depends on thousands of people continuing to follow instructions. Pilots who keep flying, ministers who keep signing, generals who keep threatening, newspapers that keep lying, and officials who keep acting as though the ruler is still untouchable. For years, those people may obey because they are loyal or because they are afraid. But once enough of them realize that everyone else is also ready to stop pretending, the illusion can collapse with incredible speed. The crowds matter. The revolutions matter. The wars and elections matter. But the final moment often comes somewhere quieter. Inside a meeting room, inside a helicopter, inside a television studio, or inside an office where a document is placed on a desk and for the first time, nobody agrees to sign it.